Now that logical reasoning is 2/3 of the LSAT, you want to make sure you're crystal clear on all the different question types. Today, I'm going to walk you through one of the most common LSAT mistakes I see and share with you how you can avoid making this on your LSAT prep. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my LSAT score from 152 to a 175 on LSAT test day. Now, the number one most common mistake I see in logical reasoning is when students can't tell the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. Even worse, a lot of prep companies themselves seem confused about the difference, lumping them together under the catch-all category of assumption questions. This is a huge mistake because these two types of questions are asking for radically different things. Necessary assumption questions are best viewed as a very specific kind of must-be-true question. And the name itself, necessary, tells you that these are in fact best viewed as a very specific kind of must-be-true because they are, after all, looking for something that is required by the argument, even if, of course, an assumption is not explicitly stated. If we were to take the argument as given, we are then logically committed to agreeing with all underlying necessary assumptions. So when you want to make sure you can tell the difference between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions, just look at the question stem. The key word or phrase in the question stem will tell you which type you're dealing with. Necessary assumption questions will contain words or phrases synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, and assumes. On the flip side, sufficient assumption questions will contain words and phrases in the question stem synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. Now, necessary assumption questions are far more common on the LSAT. They are one of the most common types of logical reasoning questions, along with inference questions and flaw questions. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, are far less common on the LSAT, and so I wouldn't want you spending an inordinate amount of time on this type of question. If you're confused about the two and having trouble with both, necessary assumption questions are a much better place to focus. You'll get a lot more bang for your buck devoting your time here, since it's one of the biggest types of questions in logical reasoning. Now, if you are totally lost when you're trying to solve a necessary assumption question, all else being equal, you're going to want to gravitate towards more moderate language in the choices. You want to look for choices containing more moderate language because they are more likely to be guaranteed by the stimulus than more extreme language would be. Sufficient assumptions, on the other hand, because they open the door to new information, doesn't matter how extreme the choice's language is, as long as it gets the job done. Another key difference between the two types is that necessary assumption questions involve informal logic, as do most types of questions on LSAT logical reasoning, meaning you don't want a diagram here. The questions are not overly convoluted in their structure, meaning that there are not tons of conditionals that you need to rearrange the pieces of in order to derive the answer in a mathematical way. There are not really formulas here where you're drawing anything out. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, are one of the few question types in logical reasoning, along with inference and parallel questions, where diagramming can sometimes be useful, but I would really recommend against diagramming in logical reasoning in the vast majority of cases. Maybe 3 or 4 questions out of 25 or 26 questions in a logical reasoning section would I ever diagram. The vast majority, diagramming just is not going to help, and in fact will most likely further complicate things. Now let's make it a little more real and concrete here with an example to illustrate what exactly is a necessary assumption and what exactly is a sufficient assumption. Let's say you wanted to go to the store and buy a $1 item. It would be sufficient to buy a $1 item if you had $1 million. That would be more than enough. It would certainly get the job done, but you don't need to have $1 million to buy a $1 item. On the other hand, having a penny or a nickel or a dime or a quarter would all be necessary to buy a $1 item. In other words, you need to possess that amount of value. You need to have at least 10 cents worth of value in your hand or in your bank account, available on your credit card, whatever. But having a dime or a quarter's worth of value, having 25 cents is not going to be sufficient to buy a $1 item, although you do need to have that amount of value and then some more, of course. Now, having $1 exactly is both necessary and sufficient to buy a $1 item. And so occasionally there is overlap between the two. In the vast majority of cases, the correct answer to a sufficient assumption question will be sufficient, but not necessary. And in fact, LSAC loves to trick people who confuse one type of question for the other, meaning for a necessary assumption question, they will often put a tempting wrong answer, sufficient assumption answer choice listed before the correct answer in the choices A through E in order to trick the unsuspecting test taker, and they will often do the opposite as well in many cases. A great example of this is the rattlesnake folktale question from Prep Test 30 in the old LSAT numbering system. Look that one up. It's one of the most difficult logical reasoning questions of all time. I think you'll agree after you give it a shot. So just be on the lookout for this sort of thing on the LSAT. And I'll share a few more strategies for sufficient assumption and necessary assumption questions in just a minute. But before I do, I wanted to let you know that if you are aiming for a 170 or above on the LSAT and you'd like our support, at LSAT Unplugged, we have a wide variety of ways we could help you. We have live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching programs. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below this video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. So what is actually the best way to solve a sufficient assumption question or a necessary assumption question? Of course, intuition is always going to be ideal if you can do it that way. But in the meantime, for sufficient assumption questions, diagramming may help. If you see several different conditional statements in the stimulus, maybe there's an evidence conditional statement and a conclusion to conditional statement, you could map out both of those and then look for the missing link, the missing conditional you could add to the evidence that, when combined with the evidence, would form a longer chain that guarantees the conclusion. There are a number of different formulas for this. There are a couple that are the most common. I have another video about this that I'll link below this one in the description below. For necessary assumption questions, on the flip side, as I said, they are informal logic, meaning diagramming is not the way to go. There's a technique you can use, often called the negation test or the denial test, where you run through the choices, negate each one, ask yourself, if I negated this choice, would it destroy the argument? If so, that's your answer, because after all, that would imply that that choice in its original form is in fact necessary. So keep that in mind when you're solving necessary assumption questions, practice your negation, and in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.